Welcome to a brief podcast regarding the acquisition lesson plan. For many of you, this probably will serve as a review of the acquisition lesson planning process. Our first question really addresses how does this acquisition lesson framework connect to what we know about the research out there and what evidence-based strategies are best to use when expecting students to learn. I want you to think of a hobby or an interest or a sport that you currently enjoy as an adult. And then I want you to think about how you first learned about that activity. How did you become skilled or knowledgeable? And then how did you develop your understanding of that activity? And now as an adult, how do you make it part of your life? I'm going to use the example of fly fishing. When my husband first decided to become engaged in the sport, he had a lot to learn. He would go to day-long seminars. He would enlist the help of a friend who helped him kind of get the basic equipment, teach him how to tie his own fly, kind of help him identify where he should go fishing. And as he became more skilled at the process of fly fishing, he would go on longer trips with some of his buddies who would teach him and then leave him alone for a little while to practice on his own. Until he got to the point where, on a bright, sunny summer Saturday morning, he would go and find his own spot, and it was his way of relaxing. It was something that he enjoyed doing to escape from the stress of daily life. And now is taking the ownership of teaching our two children how to do fly fishing, especially our daughter, who really enjoys not only learning this new sport, but also spending some quality time with Dad. Any activity that you could put into this process really mirrors what we're talking about when it comes to learning. There are 3 levels of learning. The first level, when you first are introduced to the facts, the content, or the skill, and the goal is really to be automatic in your understanding of the basics. Automaticity is also called fluency. It's when you have those skills or that content knowledge at your fingertips and can produce it very quickly. Once you have the basics down, the next level of learning is extending thinking. It's where you start to make sense of the content and you start to make meaning. You develop application of this new understanding. In the fly fishing example, this is where my husband would start to take longer and longer sessions while a friend was fishing with him, but he would pick his own spot and he would practice what he had been taught. And then the last level is authentic use. And sometimes this is difficult for teachers to provide opportunities for students to practice in the classroom. But it's really where true learning is cemented. It's where students apply what they have learned in authentic, real-world situations and are required to make decisions on the fly and adapt to what the learning situation or the real-world situation has to offer. When learning new information, research tells us we learn more by both what we say and do than if someone is just presenting the information to us. As you look at this triangle, you'll see on the left-hand side, the more active we are in the learning, the more likely we will remember and retain and be able to use and transfer that knowledge. The interesting thing, though, is when you look over on this side, this is the role of the teacher. As the activity becomes more engaging and involves the students more, the less and less a teacher is directly involved and the more active a student is participating. So let's get back to where an acquisition lesson falls in the term in the form of a unit. You know, at Loysville this summer, the 20 days that you have the students, you're really going to be focusing on a unit of study. So this graphic represents a unit. You obviously have something that starts off the unit, and it could be a review of the student learning map. It could be teaching key vocabulary that students are going to need to know in this unit. It could be activating what they might already know about the unit that you're getting ready to teach. And then you have a series of acquisition lessons where you are imparting new knowledge and new skills for them to practice within your learning unit. And either after every acquisition lesson or every couple of acquisition lessons, you want to give them an opportunity to extend their thinking and apply what they've learned. You want to coach the students in a simulated real-world experience, perhaps, but you're going to provide lots of support in how they apply what they've learned in the acquisition lesson. And then the final part of the unit is a culminating activity. This is actually the third level of learning, where they incorporate everything they've learned into some sort of meaningful, authentic use. Now, not every unit can get to this culminating activity, but because of the nature of what we're doing with these students this summer, we absolutely want to try and create for them as authentic an application as possible. Every unit has multiple levels of learning. A unit that has all three is what we call an essential unit. And it's an essential unit because it's something that all students need. Looking a little more closely at the acquisition lesson, this is what we call a word map. It's a way of breaking down a concept into multiple facets. So an acquisition lesson, the definition is simply a lesson designed to help learners acquire new knowledge and skills. This is that first layer. What is it like? Well, obviously it's acquiring, it's new, it's the first level of learning, and in order to have an acquisition lesson be successful, you need to link it to what the students might already know. So you're either linking to prior knowledge or building some background knowledge to help them give something for the new information to attach to. And that means you're going to help the students create meaning and internalize why the new information is significant, important, or how they can connect to it, because then it will store in their brain. Some very traditional or typical types of lessons require some preparation from the teacher. The teacher does some teaching, students practice, close the lesson. In an acquisition lesson, we actually chunk it a lot more, and using formative assessment helps us determine if they're gaining the new information in smaller increments before we move on. So in an acquisition lesson, it always starts with an essential question. We've kind of replaced this idea of an objective with an essential question. It starts by activating some prior knowledge. Then there's some teaching with a check, what we call distributed guided practice or distributed summarizing. Either way, these are assessment prompts that we ask the student. If it's distributed guided practice, what you might see is that each time the student gets asked a bigger question, and the information we're asking them to kind of cumulatively review what they've learned and assess them on it. Distributed summarizing could also require a cumulative effect, but you could also summarize the information learned in this lesson, not in this lesson, in this part of the lesson. Learn some new material, summarize what the student learned in this section, and so on. but it's very clear that at the end of the lesson, all students, all students will summarize the essential question, and in order to answer this question, they really should need all of this information. This type of lesson planning is very different from traditional lesson planning in that we plan by the concept, the skill, however long it takes is however long it takes, not by the day or for a class period. You will have these students for 1 hour a day, but it would not surprise me if you only address 1 or 2 lessons a week, because you're going to need to break that lesson down into smaller chunks and assess as you go to know before you can move on if they have the information. And so you might only have a lesson and a half in 1 week. There are 4 main components to an acquisition lesson, and we use the mnemonic EATS. It's the essential question, activating strategy, teaching strategy, and summarizing strategy. And we're just going to break them down a little bit into what is the strategy, what's happening in the lesson, and why is it an important piece of the lesson. In other words, what is research telling us about why we need that particular strategy? So the first is the essential question, and this is very brief in that you're sharing the lesson objective in the form of a question with the students. It helps the students focus on what really is the learning that's going to go on. And when you ask the question, the answer is the evidence that students have actually learned what you've taught them. The next part of the lesson is the activating strategy, the hook and link. You either building background knowledge by providing them some reading materials or videos or information, or you're linking to something they already know. Another key component of the activating strategy is to introduce key vocabulary. And you'll notice here, introducing key vocabulary with a research-based strategy. One of the things that we're hoping you'll do is when you're introducing that vocabulary, if that vocabulary is a multisyllabic word, you'll use the rewards strategy in helping students decode and pronounce the word. And this is a way that social studies and math and English language arts, the writing component, can support the work that's being done in the reading class and helping students be better decoders. What does the research tell us about why we do this? Well, it activates the brain. It provides the brain with like that, it's the Velcro. When you activate prior knowledge, that's 1/2 of the Velcro, so that when you start teaching, the new information has something to stick to. It creates engagement. Remember that pyramid. The more you have the student engaged in actually doing, the more likelihood they're going to learn the material. And then obviously the vocabulary piece, you may introduce it at the beginning of the lesson out of context, but by the end of the lesson, you're going to have them apply their understanding of the vocabulary within the context of the material that's in the lesson. The next part of the lesson, in my humble opinion, is the most important strategy, and that's where the actual teaching occurs. There's quite a few things that happen during the teaching part of the lesson. This is only one slide. First of all, the teacher sets up the assignment. That's the independent practice that students will actually do through the chunks of learning that the teacher is going to provide, or the chunks of instruction that the teacher is going to provide, through a series of learning experiences that are all designed to get the student to the very end and be able to answer the essential question. This is also where the questions are asked. The teacher has thought about chunking their lesson and has developed questions ahead of time, or what we call assessment prompts. So it doesn't always have to be a question. It could be something you want students to do to show that they are getting the smaller chunks that you're teaching. And as long as they're getting the smaller chunks, there's a higher success rate that by the end of the lesson they will be able to answer the EQ. We know that modeling by a teacher through think alouds and actually doing the skill and checking for mastery of those smaller skills will help the student build success and will increase the effort that a student is doing when they see they're being successful. Again, we keep going to this word doing. It's promoting active engagement. When you ask a question or give an assessment prompt, the expectation is that every single student is going to answer it. You know, we're going to talk in a little bit about how hand raising is the least effective active engagement strategy there is. You know, teachers can assess the answers of the student throughout the lesson and make adjustments as needed, and that's an effective use of formative assessment. In addition to the chunking of instruction, the use of graphic organizers, which help collect and organize the information that's being presented, is a critical piece of this type of lesson. It helps the students organize the information for remembering. It provides a visual scaffold for them. It supports them at the end of the lesson when they're trying to answer the question. They can go back to the graphic organizer and see how the information is organized. So it aids their comprehension. And then if you want them to write an answer to the LEQ, it also helps support their writing. So it's an important instructional tool, and when used accurately and appropriately, it is also a very effective scaffold and support for our students. The last item in the teaching strategy is the assignment, and that's provided to students. Now, an assignment should be independent practice, and we never want to give an assignment to students if we question whether or not they have mastered what they need in order to do the assignment. Because if they get to the assignment part and break down and can't do it, learning kind of stops. Students need to have an opportunity to apply and use the information they've learned in the lesson in a very structured, very supported environment. And then finally, the last strategy in an acquisition lesson is the summarizer. All students must answer the essential question. You can get creative in what form that answer takes, but the bottom line is that when you are done teaching, you need to go back and check to see if the students have actually mastered the information that you taught. It helps them synthesize what they've learned. They put it into their own words. It gives them ownership of their learning and also gives the teacher evidence that the learning has occurred. Here's what an acquisition lesson plan would look like. You see up here we have the essential question, and in this box we would just chunk very briefly the sections that we're going to take our lesson and break it down into. We're not going to get too detailed at this point. We just want to kind of chunk it. I'm going to walk you through that process. Next is the activating strategy, and this is whatever we're doing to build or link knowledge for the students, and this is also where we would include the vocabulary. The teaching strategy, which is obviously the biggest part of the lesson, includes the graphic organizer. There's always a little bit of instruction and then an assessment prompt, more instruction and then an assessment prompt. There's no magic to the number of assessment prompts, so you could have one, you could have two, you could have three. I would say that if you get much past 5, you have to ask yourself, is this really more than one lesson? This is the assignment, or an extending thinking activity where you start to get students to apply what they've learned. Oops. And then finally the summarizer, where they answer the LEQ. When Marzano did his research in 2001, his meta-analysis, I should say, where he looked at all of the research studies that were out there, he found, he actually had a list of like the top 33 strategies that most impact achievement, but here you see the top 5. And of these top 5, actually in some form or another, they are all part of an acquisition lesson. This is the percentile gain, and if you think of this in terms of how much improvement did a student have when they used this strategy versus how much improvement did a student have who didn't use this strategy. And when you see a percentile gain of 45, That is huge. That is a huge impact and a very effective strategy. Um, Obviously, extending thinking, which is that second level of learning. You have extending thinking activities in an acquisition lesson, but then you can have an extending thinking lesson where you're not teaching any new information and you're kind of using the information that students have learned in multiple acquisition lessons and having them apply it in a structured setting, which is the extending thinking. And I like to think of it as extending the thinking of what they've learned in the context of the content you're teaching. When you go to that authentic level, now you're talking about content that maybe you're not always teaching about, and that's that real world application. But you can see summarizing is in here. We do that. Vocabulary and context. We do that. An advanced organizer. This is the learning map, or the question that you're giving, that you're breaking it down for students ahead of time so they know the roadmap of where they're headed. And then nonverbal representations. A graphic organizer is a type of nonverbal representation before you actually start to fill it in. But this can also refer to the graphics that we use to help support student understanding of vocabulary. So that's the first part. That was just a real brief overview of what is an acquisition lesson and what are the parts. Now we're actually going to work on planning a quality acquisition lesson. If you haven't done so already, it might be a good idea to pause at this point and grab materials so that you can actually plan a lesson along with this PowerPoint. Pausing as you need, stopping and starting as often as you need to. So the second part, how do I plan a quality acquisition lesson? First off, remember, we are planning by however long it takes to learn the concept or the skill, not Monday is one lesson, Tuesday is another lesson. Many of the lessons that you're going to develop are going to take multiple days, not just because they're broader concepts, but also because your learner is going to need significant support and scaffold, maybe even some enrichment, in order to own the new information that you have chunked for them. So you should have located your lesson plan that you're going to kind of refer to for today. If you have a lesson that you've already created, great. You can kind of download the acquisition lesson plan template and rewrite the lesson in the new format, or you can make changes to your lesson right on the lesson plan, although that might be kind of difficult if you don't have all of the pieces, or you can just start from scratch and write a brand new lesson that you haven't ever done. This presentation is often given to our pre-student teachers, and so we have sample lesson plans that they can look at, and there will be sample lesson plans on EduPlanet for you to refer to. The interesting thing is when you plan an acquisition lesson, you don't plan it necessarily in the same order in which you teach it. One similarity is that, yes, both the planning and the teaching start with the essential question. So what is an essential question? Well, it is what we have learned in our pre-service teaching as the objective, except it's been turned around to be used in the form of a question. Now, there is only one EQ per lesson, and it should be engaging to the students. How do you do that? Well, you want it to be something that they are asking themselves. So you want to use student-friendly language. So, for instance, instead of saying, what are the 5 parts of an essay, you might say, how do I need to organize my essay so that the reader wants to continue reading it? Or what are the 5 components I need to make sure are part of my essay in order for the learner or the reader to get the most out of it? So you always want to turn that EQ around and pretend like the student is asking the question. And the more engaging you can make it, the more creativity you can infuse in it, the likelihood that they will say, oh, this looks like something I want to learn about. The answer to your question should then be the content that you're going to teach. and it should be based on the curriculum that you have been given. In this case, we don't have a stock curriculum, but we're going to rely heavily on the standards to guide the curriculum that we're going to use for this summer program. It is not always, pace is impacted significantly by the essential question in that you have to allocate time for every student to answer it. It doesn't always have to be answered in writing, but you need to give students time to answer the essential question. You need to review the answers that they've given you to the essential question and provide feedback, because if the learning hasn't occurred the way you need it to, you need to figure out what you need to do to go back and reteach or remediate the information. And the students should know what the essential question is, so it should be posted somewhere in the classroom or should be on their materials. So let's take a look at a couple questions, and I want you to think to yourself, is this an essential question or not? The first one, what are common characteristics of severe weather? Yes or no? If you said yes, you are correct. And if you said no, you are also correct. Well, wait a minute, what does that mean? That means it's very difficult to look at an essential question in isolation without knowing the age level of the students and the expectation. I could see this question being a unit question for younger students, and perhaps the unit would be broken down into blizzards, hurricanes, tornadoes. But it could also be a essential question in a much larger, in a unit for much older students, where the topic is severe weather, and the first thing you're going to look at is common characteristics, and then perhaps you look at what are safety precautions, and then you look at what are examples of where severe weather has hit and caused damage. So it really depends on the age of the learner. So you're going to see a couple more questions like that in here, but you're also going to see some essential questions that are absolutely not essential questions. Let's see if you can pick out which ones and why. What is 2 plus 2? Yes or no? If you said no, you are correct. This is not an essential question. It is not open-ended. It has one right answer. How would you chunk a lesson that would start with this as an EQ? A better question might be, how do I add two integers? What is the sum of two positive integers? You want to make that essential question more general and allow it to be more open-ended. What are the differences in lifestyles in the 3 colonial areas? EQ or not? If you said yes, again, you are correct. And if you said no, you are correct. This is another one of those that it really depends on the age of the child and the expectations for the unit. How do I identify facts and opinions in a passage? If you said yes, this is an essential question, you are correct. It is an open-ended question that would allow the learner to differentiate between facts and opinions. Can you see how the lesson would be broken down into what is a fact? How do I find it? What is an opinion? How do I find it? And then let's put it all together and apply it in a passage. What is a fact? Yes or no? This would be probably an assessment prompt. So the answer would be no. This is not an essential question. It is answered by a simple definition, and this would actually be rolled into a bigger EQ, kind of like number 4. Can we describe the parts of a plant? yes or no, EQ or not. If you said no, you are correct, because the question can be answered by a simple yes or no. To make this an EQ, we would just have to tweak it a little bit. Perhaps ask the question, how do we describe the parts of a plant? And that would make it more open-ended and allow for more information to be covered in the instructional process. Why does everybody keep telling me to wash my hands? EQ or not? This would be an example of an EQ. It could be part of a health class, it could be part of a science class. Can you see, can you start to break this question down into, what situations would I need to wash my hands? What are the consequences of not washing my hands? And what are the benefits of washing my hands? This question could be chunked and instruction provided in each of those sections. Why did the United States enter World War II? EQ or not? Again, this is one of those EQs that really depends on the age of the learner. At a middle school level, I could see this being a unit essential question. And you get into the geographic, the economic, the political, the religious reasons. But if you are doing a unit on World War II and you just want to focus at the high school level on the United States entry versus Japan's entry, this could be an EQ at a higher level. So when you have a student learning map, you have a group of, you have your learning map broken down into sections, and then in each section you have lesson essential questions. The example here actually shows this is an EQ for a lesson that we tend to do when we teach LFS for a whole day. And then down here, this is actually an extending thinking question that would require students to demonstrate what they've learned here and apply it in a much more general sense. The research is very clear. Ongoing formative assessment helps increase student achievement. Now, just the use of formative assessment has some benefit, but when you take that formative assessment and you analyze the answers of the students and you use their answers to drive your instructional decision-making process, that is where true learning has the best opportunity for occurring. So teachers will design their questions and learning tasks that are designed to get evidence that learning has occurred. Remember, we're still in the part where we're designing our EQ, but you've heard me reference the fact that we need to chunk our lesson into smaller, manageable parts. And so the assessments that we're going to do, or the evidence we're going to gather, is based on how we chunk that lesson. We're not necessarily ready to say, okay, what question are we asking? What evidence do we want them to produce? But we need to be thinking in terms of how are we going to break this lesson down? What are the major chunks? Because if you have an EQ and you say to yourself, I don't have any chunks, the lesson is probably not, or the question that you've created is probably not a lesson essential question. By the same token, if you think to yourself, oh yeah, I can break this lesson down into like 7 or 8 chunks, now I'm really worried that perhaps you have more than a lesson's worth of information and you need to break that lesson down into 2 pieces. Assessment prompts help us distribute the learning and the practice across a lesson. And when we use them strategically, they help the student be better prepared to answer the essential question at the end. And when a teacher is noticing that the answers aren't where they need to be and students haven't grasped the learning, the teacher can make adjustments to tweak the instruction in order to make the students more successful. This assessment prompt is the way in which they elicit the evidence from the student that learning has occurred. So it could be questions they ask, it could be prompts that they give, or it could be activities that they provide for the students to do. And then that, whatever the end product is what the teacher analyzes. Here you see kind of a visual representation of the difference between distributed guided practice and distributed summarizing. In a skill-based course, like math for instance, you may teach a little, have the students practice that skill. Teach a little more building on the skill, and now the practice is going to incorporate what they learned here and here. So this is really a cumulative effect so that by the time they get to the end, they can use every piece of the lesson that they've learned about in order to answer the question. Distributed summarizing, however, this is very similar to, or this is mostly used in content-based, like social studies. Teach a little bit, check to see that they understand this. Teach a little more, check to make sure they understand what you just taught in order to get the content mastered so that at the end of the question they can use everything they've learned to answer that question. So we're going to do a couple I-dos before I ask you to go back to your lesson and work on developing an EQ. So when is estimation better than counting? What are some pieces that I would want to chunk this lesson into? Well, first of all, I better make sure that the students understand the concept of estimation. So I'll unpack that a little bit and make sure they know what it means to estimate. I also then will have them, I will talk to them about practicing their estimation. Showing them how to estimate, talking about the estimation rules, and then finally I will show them an example where they estimate and compare it to counting and talk about how they may be similar, but most importantly how they're different, so that by the end of the lesson they can now, when given a situation, say, oh, it's better to use estimation here or counting, and then explain why. Another example might be in like a social studies class. What types of resources are used to produce goods and services? Well, what are the kinds of things that they need to understand within this question? Is there any vocabulary? They need to know the difference between a good and a service. They also need to understand that there are multiple types of resources, right? Natural, human, and capital. And then they need to be able to classify those resources based on whether or not it is a good, those resources are being used to create or manufacture a good or to provide a service. So now let's do a we do. We want to ask the question, where does the rainwater come from? Okay, so really this question is about the water cycle. So depending upon where you start in the cycle, you would first make sure that you have all of the components of the water cycle. So I'm going to test you and ask you to think about your the last time you learned about the water cycle, right? You've got evaporation, condensation, and precipitation. So you would have the three main components of the water cycle, but that's not what the question is asking. The question is saying, where does the rainwater come from? So they're going to have to start at a particular spot in the cycle to talk about where the rainwater comes from. Obviously, the rainwater is the precipitation coming from the sky. So you're going to recognize, or the students are going to be able to demonstrate they understand what the question is asking by where they start their answer in the water cycle. It's now your turn to write and revise your lesson essential question. So you're going to look at your essential question, and first and foremost, is it asking the right thing? And you know that by checking your answer. So you should ask the question and just push pause and talk out your answer. If what you have answered is what you want to teach, then you are on the right track of having a correct LEQ. If you would like to pause and do that right now, go ahead. Now that you've checked the answer to your EQ, the next part is determining the assessment prompts. How can you make this manageable for the learner? What are the chunks that you're going to break your lesson down into and teach in pieces in order to improve the likelihood that they'll be able to answer the EQ at the end? Now, understand, you can establish those chunks and you can go back and revise them once you start to write your assessment prompts. But if you can't think of any way to break this lesson down now, there's a possibility that this really isn't a good EQ. So go ahead and push pause and work on those first two pieces of your lesson. Now it's time to get back to the planning part. Obviously, we teach and we plan by starting with the essential question. That is crucial. Without a solid essential question, everything else starts to fall apart. But we don't go to activating next when planning. Actually, we go to the teaching part of the lesson. Why would you want to put time and energy into developing an activator and find that as you teach it, maybe you would prefer to use your activator, the activity you did in your activator, as part of your teaching. So it's always best to go to the teaching part of the strategy next. And here's where we incorporate everything we know about good instruction. Using graphic organizers, making sure that the instructional activities you're using are engaging. How are we getting students involved? Is the purpose established and clear? Can students understand what it is they're supposed to be learning? Are you making connections within the content? So it's not just teaching, a skill, but how does that skill connect to the bigger picture? Are you using active engagement opportunities for students to share information like collaborative pairs or numbered heads? And then what would you do if you ask a question and students can't answer it when you do your assessment prompts? Have you thought about what you might want to do that would reteach? And in an acquisition lesson, as often as you can, you want to use explicit instruction. You might hear explicit instruction called the gradual release model. Or we like to call it, or we refer to it as I do, we do, you do. The teacher does the skill, talks through in a think aloud what kinds of thinking and questions the student should be asking. Then the next part of the lesson we do together, and until once the students, the teacher has a sense that the students in the we do are successful, now it's time to do the you do. And the you do is where you can formatively assess students, because now they're independently using the content or trying the skill that you've been teaching. So let's break down a couple pieces of this teaching strategy. The first is the graphic organizers. When LFS first came across our schools, graphic organizers were kind of a new thing. I don't think these are a new thing anymore, so I'm just going to highlight a couple pieces about graphic organizers. This is one piece of research. This is actually a very large study that was done in 1995 by the U.S. Department of Ed, and it showed the impact of using a graphic organizer, what impact it had on learners, not just right after they took the test, but 10 days later, 20 days later. If you look at the amount of retention that students had, and you look at you see that it was disaggregated by learning disabled students. That was the moniker that they were given back in 1995. 3% of the students um, maintained their post-test grade without graphic organizers. I'm sorry, 8% maintained, whereas 70% maintained with when instruction included a graphic organizer. This was a very powerful study, and many more have been done with it. I had a superintendent who used to be asked by teachers, do we have to have a graphic organizer in every lesson? And he would say, well, no, only the ones where you want students to retain the information. So obviously a graphic organizer is a hugely effective tool that impacts not just short-term achievement, but also long-term retention. Breaking down a graphic organizer, you'll see it's a way of visually chunking information that improves memory. It allows students to build connections and explore relationships or follow some sort of process. At the most basic level, it helps students organize their information ideas so that they can understand and manage their learning. Two things to consider, not just how do you want your students to think about your content, okay, and these are the 5, well actually they're in here. These are the top text structures that textbook companies use when developing their text. So for instance, in a social studies book, you may see, and they could all be within one chapter, a section of a chapter where it's written in main idea and detail. In a science textbook, you may see them introduce a problem and then explain a solution. If students can learn to recognize these text structures, there are graphic organizers that will support them. So as they read or think about their content, the graphic organizer will help them visually organize the information. You also want this to be a tool that students are using. So when they're acquiring new information, how are they using the graphic organizer to take notes or to guide their reading or to help plan out writing or a project? And then once it's time to answer the EQ at the end of the lesson or practice a skill or extend their thinking, they can also go back to this graphic organizer to guide their writing. I always promoted it as a study guide when they were getting ready for the unit assessment. It's a valuable tool for them to pull out the important information to summarize, or even to talk about with a partner or an oral presentation using that graphic organizer as a guide. There are examples in an LFS book, but you can Google, and if you have an LFS book, great, you can look at it, but you can Google graphic organizer and find all kinds of examples. Some of the best examples are actually the graphic organizers that teachers create. So you want to think about how am I organizing my teaching strategies? In other words, what are the chunks of my lesson, and what's the information that I'm teaching in those chunks, so that you can start to make the connection to what kind of graphic organizer should I use. Your graphic organizer may be like a comprehensive graphic organizer that addresses all the chunks in your lesson, or it could be a graphic organizer that's used to support a chunk and doesn't necessarily need to be used in other parts of the teaching, but is an important piece in order to learn a new concept. When you're planning your teaching strategies, you want to be thinking about all of these things. This is why teaching by the seat of our pants or on the fly really is not an effective way to plan. We want to be thinking about ahead of time, how are we going to engage the students? What questions are we going to ask? Are there materials we need to have for them to answer the questions? How are we presenting the content? Is it through video? Is it lecture? Is it PowerPoint? Is it visuals? So that we have that handy, and we know exactly where the assessment prompts are going to be and what we're going to ask, so that if students don't have the information, we've already thought about how we're going to reteach or adjust our instruction. You know, talk facilitates learning. Collaborative pairs should be used in every lesson. Students need to be talking about what they're learning. And then whenever you can, how can you incorporate writing? Because that's another important piece of this learning process. Remember, assessment prompts are part of your instructional plan. They are the end of each chunk of your lesson. So if a lesson spans more than one day, an assessment prompt may actually serve as the summarizer for a particular day's learning. You don't want to get to the test. You don't want to get to the summarizer or to the test and find responses like these. I always like that one. So now it's your turn. You're going to determine what is the instruction I'm going to provide for each of these chunks. How am I going to assess? What's the prompt or question I'm going to ask? And what's the evidence the students are going to provide so I can evaluate whether or not learning has occurred? And then what kind of graphic organizer is going to either support the entire teaching part of the lesson or at least one portion of the lesson, so that students have an important tool that they can go back to and use when it's time to summarize. The next part of the lesson is the assignment. And this is where, you know, an assignment can be homework. It can be an in-class assignment. But we don't want to give students anything to do that we're not sure they have mastered the prerequisite information in order to complete the tasks. So what are students going to do to practice or demonstrate their understanding? How will they apply what they've learned? You know, this might be that extending thinking activity. So important. Can they complete the assignment independently? Do they have the skills and knowledge necessary? And then how are you communicating to them what you consider to be a quality assignment? It can come at any point in the teaching, but it's important to note that if in this example the assignment comes after assessment prompt 1 and 2, so really what they have learned in the instructional part for each of these assessment prompts could be called upon in order to complete the assignment. You can place multiple assignments in the lesson plan. You might have an assignment after the first 2 pieces of instruction and assessment prompts, and then give them more instruction and a 3rd assessment prompt and another assignment. You need to kind of feel your way. The key is you don't ask them to do anything that they're not independently capable of doing, and you know they're independently capable of doing because you've done an assessment prompt where you've measured their understanding, not for a grade, but to know whether or not more instruction is needed. One of our favorite assignments, or one of my favorite assignments, is a raft, because it's a way of potentially differentiating for students. So your students who are ready for a more challenging assignment can use that, whereas the students who have just the basics might be able to use an easier example. You'll see here that a raft is a matrix where you have the role, the audience, format, and topic. And you can either assign students a role or give them an opportunity to choose, but once they pick a role or once they're assigned a role, then they do everything in that row. So for instance, you know, in this particular assignment, a student would become a non-native species, maybe like a stink bug, and they are talking to relatives back home through the form of a postcard, and the content of their postcard should be to answer the question, how did you get to your new home and how's it going? So you can take a look at those different scenarios that students would be expected to answer. All right, it's your turn. Thinking about the sections of your lesson What assignment is going to give them an opportunity to independently practice what they've just learned? And are you going to do it at the end of all instruction, or are you going to break it up and do an assignment somewhere in between the different chunks of your lesson? Go ahead and push pause and work on the assignment, and when you're ready, we'll continue with the next part of your lesson planning. Welcome back. We've talked about the essential question and the teaching strategy, and now it's time to go to develop the activating strategy. You know, the important thing to remember is when you're activating your thinking, this should not overpower your teaching. You should allocate about 10% of the entire lesson time to developing and doing the activator. So if your lesson is 1 hour, 60 minutes, this activator should only take about 6. You'll either link it to new to prior. So if they don't have any background knowledge about what you're talking about, you need to build it. If they have background knowledge, you need to make that connection very explicit. The activator is not an announcement of what they're going to learn. It's not just saying today we're going to learn about fractions, or just a running list of the topics, or a warm-up that they should demonstrate what they're going to be taught in that lesson. It's really creating the Velcro, like I said earlier. It's activating a portion of their brain that then the new learning will be connected to or linked to, so that when it's time to go back and retrieve that information, they'll have multiple ways of retrieving it. We know through research that 2 factors primarily influence what our brains pay attention to. Can we make meaning of this new information, and is there some sort of emotion that is attached to it? It comes at the very beginning of the lesson. It could be simply a preview of key vocabulary, because vocabulary is a great background builder, but it could also incorporate an activity that is fun, engaging, interesting, enticing, and makes the learner want to learn more. Some sample activating strategies. You can recall, you can have students think about a situation that perhaps they have all experienced. You can give them a little bit of information and have them make a prediction. You can read them a story, show them a video clip, role play a situation. There's all kinds of activating strategies. Again, simply Google, activating strategies for whatever the content of your lesson is, and you'd be surprised what you'll find out there. Another key component of this activator is to preview vocabulary. We are not going to get into what constitutes good vocabulary instruction, and if you want more information on that, you just have to let us know. We have a lot of research and a lot of resources for developing vocabulary. But the key is to select the key vocabulary that you plan to explicitly teach. You can't teach it all. Some of the vocabulary you just got to give to them. But you have to determine what is the most important vocabulary they have, and then you have to teach it explicitly, and then when you get to it in the lesson, in the context of the lesson, you have to go back and remind them of what they learned. One particular research-based strategy is the FRAIR in developing vocabulary. The word is unctuous. And so some examples of what unctuous means is, a politician who's kissing babies and grandmothers, whereas a teacher helping a struggling student is not unctuous. Or a counselor advising a troubled child is not an example of unctuous behavior, but a used car salesman we can describe as unctuous. Are you starting to get a picture of what this word means? Some characteristics of unctuous: ingratiating, flattering, kowtowing, backslapping, slick, smooth, suave, obsequious. So are you getting a feeling for what kind of smarminess you might experience by a person who is described as unctuous? Here's your definition. Is this what you were thinking of as you were listening to the examples and non-examples and the characteristics? This is a lot more, this is a better way to connect to students than just saying, unctuous is attempting to charm or convince somebody in an unpleasantly suave, smug, or smooth way. You know, you can really kind of develop through multiple scenarios what unctuous is so that the students have a richer understanding of the concept. Here's a word map. Okay, and you've seen this, we've used this with acceleration. You've got the definition, and you can go either way. You can start with the examples, then go to the characteristics, and even have the students, based on those two pieces, create their own definition. Or you can start with the definition and have students fill in the characteristics or the examples. So now it's your turn. Go to your lesson, choose an activating strategy, and select a key vocabulary term that students absolutely need to know in order to understand the content of the lesson. Now here is where sometimes teachers kind of struggle, because it is not uncommon for a teacher to not have a vocabulary that they have, a term that they have to teach. In other words, not every lesson has a key vocab term that the teachers feel must be explicitly unpacked and taught in order to understand the concept of the lesson. And that might be for a variety of reasons. One, that may be a vocabulary term that you've already taught them earlier in the year and you're just coming back to it. Or, excuse me, it is a vocabulary, there is no specific vocabulary to the skill that is abstract enough that requires you to unpack it. And by unpacking, I really mean developing more than just the definition about a term. That example of unctuous, giving examples and non-examples and characteristics, multiple characteristics, or in that case synonyms of being unctuous, helps students better understand when it's appropriate to use that vocabulary. You may not have a word like that in your lesson. Okay, so now it is time for the last part of the planning. And that would be, after you've done all your teaching and you've figured out your activator, it's time to ask yourself, how are students going to answer that essential question? It comes at the very end of the lesson, and it comes at the very end of planning. Why should we have students summarize? Well, we know that it is a key thinking skill for learning by Marzano's research. It is the #2 learning strategy that impacts achievement. It also helps students create the roadmap or the schema for them to be able to retrieve that information faster, better, and longer. And if we're using it correctly as teachers, if our formative assessments along the way, teachers or students are answering the questions correctly, then we get to the summative assessment and we look at their answers and they're not getting it, perhaps the way in which we taught that lesson was not ideal. We should be, the focus of our instruction should be learning, not judging. In other words, you get to that formative assessment or that summarizer at the end, and 50% of your students demonstrate that they've learned the information and 50% show that they haven't captured it. Is that enough? Are you okay? Does it make sense to move on? I would think that you would want to go back for that 50% that did not get the information, did not demonstrate understanding, and reteach it in order to show them that, you know, this learning has been chosen specifically because of its long-term value, its essential learning, and it gives the message, we're not moving on until you get it. So we need to figure out what we need to do for you to get it. Summarizing is key to knowing when and on what to reteach. If everybody gets the answer, no reteaching required. And if you're summarizing throughout, when they get to the end, you should already know whether or not students can answer that question. Remember, the strategies that most impact achievement, summarizing is number 2. Some key points. All students summarize. They answer the essential question. Now, they don't have to answer the essential question repeated exactly as it was asked. You can break it down and chunk the essential question, but when you're done, however you originally answered that essential question is what you should see sitting in front of you when students answer the question. Please do not skip this part. This is huge. This lets you know that learning has occurred, or what learning has occurred. So now it's time for you to complete your full lesson. In order to help us provide feedback, we would like each of you to complete a lesson and then post it to EduPlanet so that as you're working with each other, like the ELA teachers could each do a lesson as part of the main unit and then share with each other, and you can reflect on the components and respond to each other, and now you've inadvertently shared the work because you don't each have to complete all the lesson planning. You can divvy the work up and have discussion and kind of divide and conquer, so to speak. So you will be provided directions on how to upload your lesson to EduPlanet so that your partner can see your lesson. 2 kind of last-minute tips to think about. I like these last 2 slides because they kind of summarize everything we've talked about. Remember, the LEQ is that question that reflects what you want students to know, understand, and do at the end of the lesson. Your activators, that hook and link. Teaching describes in detail how students are going to access the information, what you're going to do to model it, the organizer you're going to use, how you're going to use it, and the types of evidence, the questions and prompts and evidence you're going to collect to show learning is occurring. And then the summarizer. That describes how students are going to answer the EQ at the end. As you go through each component, these are some good guiding questions to have in front of you. For instance, the activator. Does it motivate the students? You don't want an activator that over-motivates them to the point where they don't even want to do the teaching, or they're disengaged from the start because it wasn't an enticing activity. So these are some things to think about in addition to the what of each lesson part. This kind of addresses the how.